In the gray pre-dawn chill of May 1536, a man of unique and terrible skill made his way across the English Channel. He was not a diplomat, a merchant, or a soldier in the conventional sense. He was an artist of death, a specialist whose reputation preceded him across the water, whispered in the corridors of power from Calais to London. His name is lost to us, but his profession was not. He was an executioner, specifically a swordsman, summoned from his home in St. Omer at the express command of King Henry VIII of England. This was an unusual, almost unprecedented expense. The Tower of London had its own axeman, a grim functionary perfectly capable of the brutal work required of him. But the axe was a crude instrument, a butcher's tool for a butcher's job. It was messy, unreliable, and deeply undignified. The sword in the right hands was different. It was swift, clean, almost silent. It was an instrument of finality, not of spectacle. The king's decision to import this foreign expert for a single, specific task was presented as an act of profound mercy, a final, gentle courtesy extended to a woman he had once moved heaven and earth to possess. But it was not mercy. It was the final, exquisite turn of the screw in a campaign of psychological annihilation so complete, so meticulously designed, that it stands as one of the most chilling examples of state-sponsored cruelty in English history. The victim for whom this special consideration was being made was his own wife, Queen Anne Boleyn. The story of Anne Boleyn's fall is often told as a swift, dramatic tragedy, a whirlwind of accusations, trials, and a sudden, shocking execution. But to view it merely as a rapid political maneuver is to miss the true horror of her final weeks. It was not simply a removal, it was an erasure. The objective was not just to end her life, but to deconstruct her very being, to strip away her titles, her dignity, her identity, and even her humanity, until the woman who knelt on the scaffold was no longer a queen, no longer a wife, no longer a mother, but merely a nameless, confessed sinner whose death was a necessary, even righteous, cleansing of the realm. We must ask not only how a queen of England came to be executed on fabricated charges of adultery, incest, and treason, but how she was systematically broken, isolated, and psychologically tormented until her death felt less like an injustice and more like a release. This is the story of that demolition, a look past the cold facts of the charges and into the terrifying, claustrophobic reality of a mind under siege, a woman forced to witness the total unraveling of her world while trapped within the cold, unyielding stone of the Tower of London. It is a cautionary tale about the absolute and terrifying nature of Tudor power, where the line between a king's love and a king's wrath was as thin and sharp as the blade of a finely honed sword. To understand the catastrophe of her end, one must first appreciate the dizzying heights of her beginning. And Boleyn was not born to be a queen. She was the daughter of an ambitious courtier, Sir Thomas Boleyn, a man of respectable lineage but not of the great, ancient nobility. What the Boleyns lacked in august blood, they made up for in cunning, ambition, and the strategic deployment of their brilliant children. And, along with her sister Mary and brother George, was given a first-class European education. She spent her formative years not in the relatively provincial English court, but in the sophisticated, glittering, and intellectually vibrant courts of the Netherlands and, crucially, France. It was here, as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude, wife of Francis I, that Anne was forged. She absorbed French fashion, language, and culture, but more importantly, she absorbed a different model of female influence. French court life allowed for women to be players in the games of power, to be intellectuals, wits, and conversationalists who could hold their own with men. She returned to England in 1522, a wholly different creature from the demure, submissive English roses who decorated Henry VIII's court. She was sharp, stylish, quick-witted, and possessed a captivating, if not conventionally beautiful, allure that lay in her dark eyes, her intelligence, and her refusal to be easily won. The society she entered was governed by a rigid and unforgiving set of expectations for women, especially those in the royal orbit. A woman's worth, and a queen's entire function, was measured by a single, brutal metric: her ability to produce healthy, legitimate male heirs. In the early 16th century, the Tudor dynasty was still a fragile entity. Henry VIII's father had won the crown on the battlefield, ending the bloody Wars of the Roses. The fear of a succession crisis, of a return to civil war, was not a distant historical anxiety. It was a palpable, ever-present dread that haunted the political landscape. Henry's wife of many years, Catherine of Aragon, had failed in this primary duty. Despite numerous pregnancies, she had produced only one living child, a daughter, Mary. For Henry, this was a personal torment and a political emergency. He saw it as a sign of God's displeasure, a curse upon his marriage to his brother's widow. It was into this charged atmosphere of dynastic panic and royal piety that Boleyn walked, not as a prospective mistress, but as something far more revolutionary and dangerous, a prospective queen. Her famous refusal to become Henry's mistress, a position her own sister Mary had occupied, was a masterstroke of strategy. It forced the king to desire not just her body, but her status as his legitimate wife, a goal that would require him to break with the most powerful institution on earth, the Roman Catholic Church. For nearly 7 years, the king's great matter consumed England. It was a period of unprecedented political, religious, and social turmoil. Henry, driven by his obsession with and his desperate need for a son, battled the Pope, sacked his powerful Chancellor Cardinal Wolsey, and ultimately severed England from Roman Catholicism, declaring himself supreme head of the Church in England. And Boleyn was the catalyst for this revolution. At her zenith, she was more than a consort. She was a partner in power, a key advocate for religious reform, and a figure of immense influence. Her coronation in June 1533 was a spectacle of breathtaking magnificence, a deliberate statement of her legitimacy and power. When she became pregnant, the entire kingdom held its breath, praying for a prince who would justify the schism and secure the Tudor line. In September 1533, she gave birth. The child was healthy, strong, but it was a girl, Elizabeth. While a crushing disappointment to Henry, it was not yet a disaster. There would be other pregnancies, other chances. For a brief, shining moment, and was secure, the triumphant queen who had remade a kingdom in her own image, the wife for whom a king had risked his soul. This was the pinnacle, the sun-drenched peak from which she was about to fall with terrifying speed. The turning point, the precise moment the ground gave way beneath her, can be dated with chilling accuracy. It was the 29th of January, 1536. On that day, and roughly 4 months pregnant, miscarried. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, an ardent enemy of Anne's, reported with grim satisfaction that the lost fetus was a male child. Whether this was true or merely malicious propaganda, the effect was the same. It was the final, unforgivable failure. This was not just a personal tragedy. It was a political death sentence. In the unforgiving calculus of Tudor succession, she had been weighed and found wanting one too many times. Henry VIII's patience, already worn thin by her sharp tongue and political assertiveness, snapped. His infatuation, which had burned so hotly for a decade, turned in an instant to icy contempt and revulsion. He saw the miscarriage not as a sad accident of biology, but as a divine judgment, proof that God had refused to bless this union, just as he had refused to bless his first. The story, perhaps apocryphal but entirely believable, is that Henry stormed into her chamber, looked upon his grieving wife, and coldly declared, "I see that God will not give me male children." He then turned his back on her, leaving her in her sorrow, and effectively sealed her fate. This final, fatal miscarriage did not occur in a vacuum. It was precipitated by a moment of extreme stress just days earlier. The king, a passionate juster, had suffered a severe fall from his horse during a tournament at Greenwich. For several hours, he lay unconscious, and it was feared he was dead. The shock of this news, the terror of being left a widow in a hostile court with a new and powerful Catholic faction rising against her, is said to have been the direct cause of Anne's premature labor. The tragic irony is overwhelming. The king's brush with death directly triggered the event that would lead to her own. With the loss of the male heir, the last pillars supporting her precarious position crumbled. Henry now had his justification. He had risked everything for this woman, and she had failed him. His conscience, that famously flexible and self-serving instrument, began to tell him not that he had made a mistake, but that he had been deceived, tricked, even bewitched. His gaze had already begun to settle elsewhere, upon a young, quiet, and altogether different kind of woman, the pale, demure, and submissive Jane Seymour. The political wolves, chief among them the king's brilliant and ruthless chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, saw their opportunity, and in her powerful, reformist faction had become an obstacle. With the king's affection gone, she was vulnerable. It was time to clear the board, and in the Tudor court, clearing the board was a bloody business. The conspiracy against Anne Boleyn was assembled with terrifying speed and clinical precision, a testament to the organizational genius of Thomas Cromwell. The goal was not merely to arrange a divorce. That would be too slow, too complicated, and would cast doubt on the legitimacy of any future marriage. Furthermore, it would leave Anne alive, a potential rallying point for her allies and a constant reminder of the king's folly. The solution had to be permanent and absolute. It required charges so heinous that they would not only justify her execution, but would also retroactively invalidate her marriage and bastardize her daughter, Elizabeth, clearing the path for a new queen and new, legitimate heirs. The plot began not with the nobles of the court, but at its fringes with a man named Mark Smeaton, a handsome and talented musician of humble birth who served in the queen's household. On April 30th, Smeaton was arrested and taken to Cromwell's house in Stepney for interrogation. What happened there is not recorded in detail, but the outcome is clear. Under, it is almost universally agreed, horrific torture, Smeaton confessed to having committed adultery with the queen. His confession, extracted by pain and fear, was the key that unlocked the entire sordid affair. It was flimsy, uncorroborated, and came from a man who would have said anything to make the agony stop, but it was enough. With Smeaton's confession in hand, Cromwell moved swiftly up the social ladder. The next day, May 1st, a day of May Day, justs and celebrations at Greenwich, the trap was sprung. During the festivities, Henry was seen to rise abruptly, his face a mask of thunderous rage, and leave with a small retinue for Westminster. The official story was that he had been given information about the Queen's misconduct. The arrest followed immediately. Sir Henry Norris, a groom of the stool and one of the King's closest and most trusted friends, was taken. Sir Francis Weston and William Brereton, both prominent and wealthy gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, were next. The final and most shocking arrest was that of the Queen's own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The charges were almost unthinkable: adultery with the Queen. In George's case, the accusation was even more monstrous: incest. The net had been cast, and 5 men, all connected by their proximity to and were now prisoners in the Tower. The very next day, on May 2nd, Queen Anne herself was summoned before a council of nobles, informed of the charges, and arrested. As she was rowed by barge to the Tower of London, passing under the infamous Traitor's Gate, the full horror of her situation began to dawn on her. The fortress that had been her residence before her glorious coronation was now her prison. Within the cold stone walls of the Tower, and psychological ordeal began in earnest. We have a remarkable, if biased, window into her state of mind through the letters of the Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, to Thomas Cromwell. Kingston was her jailer, a man tasked with watching her every move and reporting her every word. His letters paint a portrait of a woman oscillating wildly between disbelief, terror, hysteria, and moments of defiant clarity. Upon her arrival, she collapsed, demanding to know where she would be lodged and why. When told she would be placed in the same royal apartments she had occupied before her coronation, the irony was so bitter she broke into a fit of desperate, hysterical laughter. She asked Kingston if she was being sent to a dungeon. He assured her she would be in the chamber she knew. "It is too good for me," She reportedly wept before bursting into another peal of laughter that deeply unsettled her guards. Her mind, reeling from the shock, struggled to grasp the reality of the accusations. She babbled almost constantly, her thoughts racing, jumping from one subject to another. She spoke of the men arrested, declaring their innocence. She worried aloud about what they might be forced to confess. She recalled seemingly innocent conversations with Norris and Weston, moments of courtly flirtation that were now being twisted into evidence of treasonous adultery. This constant, nervous chatter was a symptom of her terror, but was also a weapon used against her. Kingston and the ladies assigned to watch her, women deliberately chosen from families hostile to her, recorded every utterance. Her frantic declarations of innocence, her recollections of casual remarks, her weeping, her laughter, all were reported back to Cromwell, who was carefully weaving these fragments into a tapestry of guilt, and was trapped in a panopticon of her own making, where her every expression of fear and confusion was interpreted as evidence of a guilty conscience. She was isolated from all friends and allies, denied legal counsel, and subjected to relentless psychological pressure. She worried for her mother and father, for her little daughter Elizabeth, and for the souls of the men she knew were being condemned on her account. One of the cruelest torments was the uncertainty of her fate. She asked Kingston if she would be burned at the stake, the traditional punishment for a woman convicted of treason. The fear of that agonizing death by fire haunted her waking moments and her sleepless nights, a constant, terrifying specter in the gloom of her royal prison. The woman who had commanded a court with her wit and intelligence was being systematically reduced to a state of near madness, her mind unraveling under the calculated and unceasing pressure of her captors. The legal proceedings that followed were a grotesque parody of justice, a piece of political theater whose conclusion was pre-written. On May 12th, the four commoners, Smeaton, Norris, Weston, and Brereton, were put on trial at Westminster Hall. The evidence presented was laughably thin, based almost entirely on Smeaton's coerced confession and a collection of overheard remarks and court gossip. Smeaton pleaded guilty, likely in a desperate and futile hope of mercy. The other three men pleaded not guilty and maintained their innocence with courage and dignity. Sir Henry Norris was even offered a pardon if he would confess and implicate the Queen. He refused, choosing to die rather than betray her. It made no difference. The jury, packed with men loyal to the king and Cromwell, delivered the foregone conclusion. All four were found guilty of treason and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the horrific punishment reserved for the worst offenders. The king, in another gesture of hollow mercy, later commuted this to the less gruesome sentence of beheading. 3 days later, on May 15th, it was Anne's turn, along with her brother George. They were tried not by a common jury, but by a court of their peers in the King's Hall within the Tower of London. The spectacle was presided over by their own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, a man who had long resented the Bullen's influence and was now all too willing to preside over their destruction. The charges against and were read out: adultery with the 5 men, including her own brother, and conspiring the king's death. The incest charge was particularly vile, designed to paint her as a creature of unnatural depravity, a monster who had defiled the royal bed in the most obscene way imaginable. The evidence for this was a single reported conversation where Anne had told her sister-in-law, Lady Rochford, that the king was no good in bed, a flimsy piece of hearsay from a woman who despised her husband and was eager to see him fall. Despite the lack of any credible evidence, and having no counsel to speak for her, and defended herself with remarkable composure, intelligence, and dignity. Onlookers, including the hostile ambassador Shopweis, were impressed by her articulate and calm refutations of the charges. But her defense was irrelevant. The verdict was never in doubt. The panel of peers, their own lives and careers dependent on the king's favor, unanimously found both Anne and George guilty of all charges. Upon hearing the verdict, the Duke of Norfolk, his voice thick with emotion, whether genuine or feigned, we cannot know, sentenced them to death. For George, it was to be beheading. For Anne, the sentence was pronounced with a particular, chilling cruelty. She was to be burned alive or beheaded. As his majesty in his pleasure shall command, she was forced to stand and listen to this horrific uncertainty, the specter of the flames returning to haunt her. Yet, even at this moment of total defeat, she maintained her composure. She raised her hands to the heavens and made a solemn oath, not of defiance, but of innocence. "O Father, O Creator," she declared, "Thou who art the way, the truth, and the life, Thou knowest that I have not deserved this death." It was a powerful, dignified appeal to the only court she had left. But the humiliations were not over. In a final, vicious act of legal and symbolic annihilation, just 2 days before her execution, her marriage to Henry was formally annulled by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the very man who had once been her greatest clerical ally. The grounds were her supposed pre-contract to Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and, more darkly, Henry's own previous affair with her sister, Mary. The woman condemned to die as queen was now told she had never legally been one. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was declared a bastard. The erasure was nearly complete. She would die not as Queen Anne, but as the disgraced Lady in Bullen, a common adulteress and traitor. The final act of this grim drama was set for Friday, the 19th of May, 1536. The execution had been delayed by a day, a final, torturous wait for the condemned queen, as the swordsman from Calais completed his journey. This delay only heightened the psychological torment, granting her another 24 hours to contemplate the mechanics of her own death. That morning, she rose early. She attended Mass with her jailer, Sir William Kingston, and took the sacrament. In his presence, she swore one last time on the eternal salvation of her soul that she was innocent of the crimes for which she was to die. It was a final, desperate attempt to clear her name before God, if not before men. She then began to prepare for her final public appearance. She chose her attire with care, a gown of gray or black damask, trimmed with ermine, and over it, a crimson kirtle. It was a somber but regal choice, the dress of a noble woman, not a penitent sinner. Her famous style and sense of theater did not desert her, even at the end. She was determined to meet her fate not as a hysterical, broken creature, but as the queen she still believed herself to be in the eyes of God. Around 9 in the morning, the summons came. She was led from her apartments out onto Tower Green, where a new scaffold had been erected. This was not to be a public spectacle in the usual sense. The execution was to be held within the confines of the tower, before a select crowd of around 1,000 people. Courtiers, city officials, and nobles, including Thomas Cromwell and Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, men who had engineered her downfall. They were there to witness the finality of their victory. As she mounted the straw-strewn platform, she would have seen the faces of the men who had condemned her. She would have seen the executioner, a formidable figure in black, standing silently with the instrument of her death, not an axe, but a heavy, two-handed executioner's sword, a weapon unfamiliar and terrifying to English eyes. She looked out at the small, silent crowd, her ladies-in-waiting weeping behind her. The unbearable tension was broken only by her own voice, clear and steady. Her final speech is one of the most remarkable and debated utterances in English history. It was not a fiery declaration of innocence or a furious condemnation of her enemies. It was a masterpiece of restraint and maternal protection. "Good Christian people," she began, "I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." She made no admission of guilt, but she did not challenge the process that had condemned her. To do so would have been to challenge the king himself, an act of treason that could have sealed her daughter Elizabeth's fate. She continued, "I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor more merciful prince was there never. And to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." These words, praising the man who had ordered her death, are shocking to modern ears. But they were a calculated and brilliant final move. They were the words of a loyal subject, designed to appease Henry's monumental ego and, most importantly, to safeguard the life of her child. She concluded simply by asking for the prayers of the onlookers. After her speech, the quiet, horrifying ritual began. She knelt down, her bearing erect and dignified. One of her weeping ladies tied a blindfold over her eyes. The executioner, following the custom of his trade, approached her to ask for her forgiveness, which she gave. The final moments were a study in practiced, chilling efficiency. While one of her ladies was still adjusting the blindfold, the swordsman, to distract her and ensure a clean, swift blow on an unstrained neck, was said to have called out, "Boy, bring me the sword." As Anne's head likely turned towards the sound, he, having already drawn the heavy blade, swung it in a silent, lethal arc. It was over in a single, fluid motion. The head of a queen, the woman who had launched the English Reformation, tumbled onto the straw. Her lips, it was said, continued to move for several seconds, as if in silent prayer. A cannon fired from the battlements of the tower, the prearranged signal. Miles away, King Henry VIII, who was said to have been waiting for the sound, knew his path was clear. "The deed is done," he reportedly cried. "Unleash the hounds, and let us have sport." He was now free to marry his new love, Jane Seymour. The indignities for Anne Boleyn did not end with her death. In a final, damning testament to the haste and contempt with which she was dispatched, no coffin had been prepared for her. As her weeping ladies gathered her head and body, wrapping them in a white cloth, a search was made for something, anything, in which to place her remains. All that could be found was a long, rough-hewn arrow chest from one of the Tower armories. The body of the former Queen of England, the mother of the future Queen Elizabeth I, was unceremoniously bundled into this crude wooden box. She was buried without ceremony or monument in an unmarked grave within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower's parish church. She was laid to rest beside the headless body of her own brother, George, who had been executed 2 days prior. The chapel was already the burial place of traitors. Now it was the final, anonymous resting place of a queen whom the state wished to utterly forget. The erasure was physical, tangible, and complete. The immediate aftermath was swift and brutally efficient, a testament to the meticulous planning of Cromwell and the king. The official narrative was aggressively promoted, and was not a tragic victim, but a depraved monster, a sorceress and a whore who had thankfully been purged from the body politic. Her name was systematically scrubbed from records. Her heraldic badges were painted over, her insignia removed from royal palaces. It was as if the kingdom was trying to collectively forget she had ever existed. This propaganda was essential to legitimize what came next. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. The shocking speed of this union laid bare the true motive behind the entire bloody affair. It was not about justice, it was about succession. It was about clearing the way for a new wife who, it was hoped, would finally provide the male heir Henry craved. In this, Jane would succeed where Anne and Catherine had failed, giving birth to the future King Edward VI the following year, though she herself would die from complications of the childbirth. For a time, it seemed Henry had won, that Anne's memory had been successfully extinguished, and her legacy reduced to a shameful footnote. The long-term consequences of Anne's execution, however, played out with a profound and delicious historical irony that neither Henry nor Cromwell could have ever foreseen. While Henry got his short-lived male heir, the Tudor dynasty's future did not lie with him. Edward VI died as a teenager, and after the brief, catastrophic reign of Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary I, the throne passed to the one person whose existence was a direct and inconvenient consequence of the affair, Anne's daughter, Elizabeth. The child who had been declared a bastard, the living symbol of a marriage the state had tried to erase, inherited the kingdom. And she would go on to rule for over 4 decades, becoming arguably England's greatest and most iconic monarch. In her long and glorious reign, Elizabeth I subtly but deliberately rehabilitated her mother's memory. She wore Anne's jewelry, most famously a locket ring containing a portrait of herself and one of her mother. She promoted men from Boleyn family connections. She did not need to shout her mother's innocence from the rooftops. Her very existence, her success as a queen, was the ultimate vindication. And Boleyn's blood, the bloodline Henry had so violently sought to discard, ultimately defined England's golden age. The historical debate surrounding Anne's fall continues, though there is virtually no serious historian today who believes she was guilty of the charges laid against her. The case was a fabrication, a legal lynching orchestrated to serve the king's will. The primary debate centers on the architect of her downfall. Was Thomas Cromwell the Machiavellian mastermind who, seeing and as a political liability and a block to his own power, convinced a willing king to destroy her? Or was he merely the brutally efficient servant, carrying out the explicit and murderous desires of a tyrannical monarch who had simply grown tired of his wife and desperate for a new one? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Cromwell was the architect of the mechanism, but Henry was the source of the will. It was a symbiotic relationship of convenience and terror, a minister providing the legal framework for a king's ruthless personal desires. It demonstrates the terrifying nature of a government where law is not a shield for the innocent, but a weapon for the powerful, a tool that can be twisted to justify any atrocity. The story of Anne Boleyn's final days is more than just a political drama. It is a profound and tragic exploration of human fragility in the face of absolute power. It is a cautionary tale about how swiftly a person can be dehumanized by propaganda, how a complex, intelligent, and ambitious woman can be flattened into a two-dimensional caricature of a witch and a whore to serve a political narrative. Her fate highlights the brutal reality for women of her era, even those at the apex of society. Their power was entirely contingent, their worth measured by their wombs, and their lives forfeit to the whims of the men who controlled them, and dared to be more than a passive vessel for the royal bloodline. She was an active political player, a religious reformer, and an intellectual partner to the king. It was this very strength, this very intelligence that so captivated Henry in the beginning, that became intolerable to him in the end. He required a queen, not a rival. The contrast between the public image created by the Tudor state and the private reality of Anne's suffering is stark and horrifying. The official propaganda machine painted a portrait of a monster, a woman of insatiable lust and monstrous ambition who deserved her fate. But the historical record, however fragmented, gives us glimpses of the truth. A terrified, isolated woman, fighting for her life and her sanity within a prison of stone and fear. A mother whose final, carefully chosen words on the scaffold were not for herself, but for the future safety of her daughter. A queen who, even when stripped of her title, her dignity, and her life, refused to be entirely broken, meeting her horrific end with a composure and courage that unsettled even her enemies. In the end, the attempt to erase Anne Boleyn failed completely. She haunts the pages of English history, a figure of endless fascination, tragedy, and controversy. Her story endures not because of how she lived as a queen, but because of the calculated cruelty with which she was made to die. The silent, swift stroke of the French sword was not an act of mercy. It was the final, theatrical flourish in a spectacle of erasure. But memory is more resilient than stone, and truth, however brutally suppressed, has a way of enduring. The unmarked grave in the Tower Chapel could not hold her. Her true and lasting monument was not a tomb of cold marble, but the glorious reign of the daughter she died to protect. In that, the ultimate irony, and Boleyn had the last, silent, and triumphant word. Her ghost does not linger in the Tower of London as a weeping specter, but as a permanent reminder of the ultimate price of power and the woman whose brutal end gave England its greatest queen.